Khrushchevka is one of the distinctive representatives of Soviet architecture, being one of the most common types of residential buildings in the Soviet Union. Khrushchevkas have become an integral part of life, including Moscow. The appearance in the capital of the USSR, as well as in most provincial cities, was determined precisely by the presence of these houses, which is visible in our time. Looking at such districts of Moscow as Tropareva, Chertanovo, Mitina, and many others, one gets the impression that panel houses have been standing here forever, but this is not the case. And in this video we will talk about the history of founding Khrushchevkas in Moscow. It is worth saying a few words about where and how Moscovites lived before the appearance of Khrushchevkas. From 1928 to 1939, the population of Moscow doubled from 2 to 4 million people, and the construction industry could not keep up with this. People mostly lived in so-called kommunalki, communal apartments, and also dormitories, barracks, and sometimes in basements and dugouts. If in 1930 in Moscow the average norm of living space was 5 square meters per person, then by 1940 it had decreased to almost 4 square meters. In the provinces the situation was often even worse. In general, the living conditions of an ordinary Muscovite were difficult. There was often no hot water, many people in one room, the toilet was often only on the street, the houses as a whole were worn out. Of course, many will remember the famous Stalinkas, with spacious rooms, high ceilings, and generally good, even by today's standards, living conditions. But they were intended for intellectuals, foreign specialists, party workers, that is, for a rare category of citizens. It is obvious that the outbreak of war in 1941 made the housing situation completely catastrophic. Although Moscow did not suffer as much as Leningrad or Stalingrad, many people lost their homes. After the end of the war, the country faced a severe housing crisis, which needed to be dealt with. Before the Second World War, work was underway in the USSR to create panel houses. This idea was recalled during the war. At the end of 1933, the issue of accelerated construction of permanent housing for workers arose in the Urals. In this regard, an emergency meeting was held in Sverdlovsk. Chief engineer Alexei Smirnov proposed reinforced concrete panels as a material. During a stormy meeting, Smirnov's proposal was approved. Production was launched in the city of Berezovsky, a suburb of Sverdlovsk, and the country's first panel house was assembled here in December 1945. The first experimental frame panel houses in Moscow began to be commissioned in 1948. First, a 4-story building was commissioned at 43 Budyonovo Ave on Sokolynaya Gora. Then a whole block was built along the first Khrushchevsky passage of 4- and 5-story buildings. At the end of the 1940s, the serial method of standard houses design was adopted, and its application throughout the country made it possible to restore the housing stock to a significant extent. However, these were not Khrushchevkas yet, it was something in between. For example, in Leningrad there were houses of type 1, 506, one of the first of its kind. These houses were called panel Stalinkis. These houses inherited the square footage of rooms, ceiling height, separate bathrooms, and thick exterior walls from Stalinkas. The situation was improving, but the housing crisis did not go away. The housing situation in the country was still difficult. In 1953 Stalin died, and after a while Khrushchev came to power. De-Stalinization begins, including in architecture. Khrushchev criticized the Stalinist architects for excesses and extra expenses in housing construction, suggesting to optimize it. In 1957, the Central Committee of Communist Party adopted a resolution on the development of housing construction in the USSR. A new era has begun in Soviet architecture, including in Moscow. The mass construction of residential buildings is becoming even more widespread, and the transition to panel houses is finally underway. Now Soviet architecture was characterized by simplicity, economy, and convenience. At least so it was claimed, for the average person. In the Cheremушки district in Moscow in 1956, the so-called Ninth Quarter was created, consisting entirely of panel houses. And if the panel houses, which we talked about earlier, still contained the features of Stalinist architecture, then the first full-fledged Khrushchevki appeared in the new Cheremушки. The Ninth Quarter was an experimental area, and after the successful use of Khruschyovkas here, they began their rapid spread throughout the USSR. Nathan Osterman, a young architect who built housing for evacuees during the war years, was appointed head of the construction of the Ninth Quarter. For the first time in the USSR, sociological studies of typical housing began to be conducted in New Cheremушки, which provided feedback to architects. Exhibitions were even held directly in the apartments of the built houses for domestic and foreign architects, and then for ordinary citizens. At the time, a wide propaganda campaign was underway in the country, including in Moscow, as a result of which the name New Cheremушки became a symbol of a qualitatively new way of life for a Soviet person. Even after Khrushchev's resignation, the houses named after him were still actively being built. Yes, panel houses developed further. Dozens, if not hundreds, of types of panel houses appeared in the USSR, and after a while Brezhnevki appeared altogether, more improved versions of Khrushchevkas. But all that is beautiful does not last forever, and in 1969 the resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party on measures to improve the quality of housing and civil construction was issued, and the gradual abandonment of the construction of Khrushchevkas began. After 1972, Khrushchevkas stopped being built in Moscow. What can be said in the end? It was in Moscow that the Khrushchevkas appeared, and from here they spread thousands of kilometers. As it was sung in one Soviet song, from Moscow to the very outskirts. And despite the fact that the Khrushchevkas themselves have often been associated with speed and their appearance is associated exclusively with the mid-1950s and with the so-called con men, the appearance and consolidation in the capital, as we can see, took a significant amount of time and was a very smooth process. And despite the fact that when we imagine Moscow, we associated it more with some sites, we should not forget that even ordinary, countless apartment buildings to which Moscovites managed to get used back in 1960s still determine the basic appearance of Moscow, especially in some of its districts.